Cry of Fear is an indie survival horror game developed by the Swedish studio Team Sykesgalar all the way back in 2012, which was actually 12 years ago now. Jesus. Anyways, Cry of Fear follows the story of Simon Henriksson, a 19-year-old Swede raised in Kirkville, whom we can assume lives in Stockholm, or at very least works there. Now I hope you're ready for this knowledge bomb on Cry of Fear's story, but it's actually very important for the entire concept of this video. Thank you, coolest YouTuber ever alive 123. From this point on, there will be spoilers on Cry of Fear's story. You got that? This is your warning. Okay? We all good to move on? Right. Lovely. None of this is real. No, really. None of it's real. The player character has never physically existed. At the start of the game, you see this cutscene. This is what happens before the events of the game even happen. You see, Simon Henriksson has anxiety and depression, and this quote-unquote accident ends up disabling him, making him wheelchair bound for the rest of his life, according to a psychiatrist, Dr. Purnell. Simon has lived with mental problems for a long time, Simon stating the following in the intro to the game.
I've always felt alone. My whole life. For as long as I can remember. I don't know if I like it, or if I'm just used to it. But I do know this. Being lonely does things to you. Feeling shit, bitter and angry all the time just eats away at you.
So if the player character and the world around him isn't actually real, then what on earth is happening in it? Well, after the accident, Simon, or more likely his family, hired a counsellor to keep track of his mental health and his progress towards moving on from the accident and getting his life back to a less destructive state. Dr. Purnell notes how, whenever questions about his personal life, Simon refuses to comment, and due to this, Purnell recommends for Simon to take all those bottled up thoughts and write them into a book, as a more simple way for him to get out of his head. That's what we're playing in Cry of Fear. We are living through the events of the book as Simon writes them. Every single encounter, hallucination, enemy, puzzle is Simon's emotionally charged interpretation of what actually happened. Throughout the game, Simon will have a series of flashbacks, and these are the actually real parts of the story. The events in these flashbacks happen to the real crippled Simon. It's at this point where it becomes pretty important to separate the book Simon and the actual wheelchair-bound Simon of the real world. The consistent way we can separate these two is by what they wear. Book Simon wears the same clothes that he was wearing at the time of the accident, which I'll note that Simon dubs the Black Day, quote-unquote. My theory for this name comes from both the extreme trauma that comes with such an event, but also because this is the point of divergence between two parts of Simon's psyche. Up until this point, Simon had only been self-loathing. He never blamed anyone else for the problems in his life, instead thinking it was all him and him alone who was responsible. This materialized itself in the more physical sense with Simon self-harming, indicated by the scars on his wrists that we can see when using morphine. But after the Black Day, Simon became more bitter. He felt helpless, stuck in his wheelchair and having to depend on his mother for just about everything. He felt isolated and started to resent those around him. All but one person, a young woman by the name of Sophie. She happens to be Simon's closest and only friend, not to mention Simon's secret love interest. However, Simon tried to confess to her in the past and was disappointed and quite frankly crushed, as he learned that she did not share the same feelings for him. The way Simon sees those around him roughly revolves around them either pitying him or abandoning him, in the case of Sophie. Simon was always troubled before the accident, however it only further turned to bitterness after the accident. Book Simon is far more assertive and aggressive than his usual counterpart, which we can see in the cutscenes. This heightened emotional response likely coming from his newfound bitterness. Let's move away from Simon now and let's see what he's up against, as these enemies all have a meaning, a level of symbolism behind them. Let's start with the most basic enemy you will encounter, the Slower. These enemies are essentially just zombies with blunt weapons. They twitch and move around erratically, which can make them a little harder to fight in gameplay, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for the meaning of this enemy, what the Slower symbolizes, specifically. Well, it comes in their movements and their weapons. The weapons are blunt, such as hammers. This is much like the blunt force of a car that struck him. Not to mention their impaired movement, which reflects how Simon feels with his wheelchair. The next monster we encounter is the Faster. The Faster is a heavily mutilated woman with sharp, blade-like arms and legs, emitting a constant screech whenever near Simon. Notably, the Faster doesn't actually die like a normal enemy, instead opting to give up and simply finish the job for you. They don't even give you the satisfaction of winning, just the feeling that they gave up. The symbolism here is with the metallic appendages, mirroring Simon's wheelchair, and obviously the Faster opting to give up represents Simon's own desire to commit suicide. The Faster being the slight force slowly creeping into his thoughts. A more intrusive representation of Simon's suicidal tendencies is found in the Drowned enemy, that has no physical attack, but instead forces Simon to turn his gun on himself. We'll only cover a few more of these enemies, as many follow a formula of either symbolising Simon's general distaste for people, with his bitterness, or just a theme of suicide, either as an attack or a last resort. Let's look to the more interesting ones, one of which being the Saw Runner. The Saw Runner is an extremely fast and extremely lethal chainsaw-wielding enemy. Its physical appearance mostly resembles a person, save for one detail: a myriad of masks tied directly to his head, all of which having an eerie smile plastered onto them. His appearance symbolises the way that Simon would try to hide and mask his true emotions around other people, whilst his gameplay aspects represent Simon's anxiety attacks or even his deteriorating sanity. Much like anxiety, the Saw Runner is strong, fast, and can come at any second. Sticking with the theme of Simon's social life, or lack thereof, we find the Faceless, likely a blend of Simon's anxiety in a more social setting, but also how he can't find it in himself to look people in the eyes, thus being the reason for them lacking faces. He simply didn't see them and thus can't paint the picture in his mind. Moving on, we have the Citalopram. This name may seem a little bit random, but it actually makes sense, as citalopram is the name of an antidepressant that Purnell prescribes to Simon. The enemy has quick, panicked breathing, which is a common side effect of the drug. Moving on, now we're closer to the end of the game, and we find the Stranger enemy. They're a pretty rare one, but seriously lethal. Their appearance is quite on the nose, as they have a book in the place for a head. This represents the way that the book has started to warp Simon's mind, taking a toll on his psyche, and further empowering his book self. Now, throughout the game, there are boss fights to conclude chapters of the campaign. These boss fights are sort of a way for Simon to get over certain things, and finally confront those parts of his mind. Let's go through these in the order that they show up. First, we have Sora. His main method of attack being an instant kill chainsaw to the waist, cutting off Simon's legs, much the same way that he feels happened with the accident. Second, we have Mace. Mace hits with the force of a car. Get it? But also he appears wrapped in bandages and has a slow, stumbling walk, matching the way that Simon feels broken and disfigured. Third up, we have Carcass. Now this boss fight starts right after Sophie kills herself, at least in book form. This is Simon's rough way of getting over her, and Carcass is the bloated embodiment of Simon's grief for her, with a little bit of his self-hatred sprinkled in for good measure. Carcass being the embodiment for how Simon feels in his wheelchair, a mere corpse, tied down to a chair. This is where we get a choice. In this boss fight, we can choose to either stay and kill Carcass, or we can run and spare Carcass. This affects the game's ending. If you choose to run from Carcass, then the guilt and the depression tied to Sophie only continues to fester, and will lead to Simon spitefully murdering her. Whilst those who do kill Carcass let Simon make peace with Sophie, and instead move on. Speaking of moving on, we get to the fourth boss, Dr. Purnell himself. Upon meeting Dr. Purnell, he asks Simon to find a gun that he lost, his Ruger P345. It's a strong pistol, but it symbolically represents Simon opening up to Purnell, as we can choose to either give him the pistol or keep it to ourselves. Whilst it hurts more to open up and give Purnell the gun, it also allows Simon to trust him and get some help. However, Book Simon here seems to be, we'll say, losing it a little. Yeah, sure. This pistol option before the boss fight also changes the ending of the game. If Simon trusted Purnell, he is spared, and even addressed somberly in his suicide note. However, if Simon chose to not trust him, then he murders him in his apartment. Now it's at this point that we can see most of the writing on the wall, but no. There's actually 4 separate endings to Cryophear's story. In all of the bad ones, Book Simon overpowers and kills Simon in the real world, driving him to suicide. In all but 1. Let's go over these endings. One where Simon trusts no one and lets his emotions fester, culminates to not only killing both Sophie and the Doctor, but also stating that he wishes he could have killed more before committing suicide. This is the worst endings for obvious reasons. The second ending here would be if Simon spared Carcass and never got over Sophie, but instead did trust Purnell. He chooses to murder Sophie in a selfish act to have her to all to himself, and respecting Dr. Purnell for trying to help. However, he still takes his own life. The third ending is a similar mirror to the second one, just instead of killing Sophie, he kills Purnell, pleading in his suicide note that Sophie cannot see his body. The fourth ending can play out only if you choose all the good options in the story. You pick to trust Purnell and kill off Carcass, thus leading to the showdown between Book Simon and Real Simon. The Real Simon has total tank controls, and it really gets the point across how Simon really feels. It's an absolute pain to be this slow and unable to maneuver, but through a hard struggle, the Real Simon overcomes the odds and wins, coming back to reality and realizing that he killed police officers that were sent to check on him. However, he finally killed off the trauma and pain in his mind, later being committed to a mental hospital and living the rest of his life there. He is routinely visited by Dr. Purnell and continues to be his counselor and now mentor, to which Simon is very grateful for. Sophie even visits Simon regularly, however destabilizing she may be. Simon wishes her nothing but the best in the future. Ain't that sweet? Hey there! Now that this is the intro, I thought this would be a good place to say thank you for watching, but also a special thank you to commenter coolest YouTuber ever alive 123 for giving the idea to this video. I had a lot of fun making this and I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to like, subscribe, comment even too. It helps the algorithm, I think. Regardless, bye bye.